When we think of the Greens, many adjectives might leap to mind. Some might describe the Greens as arrogant, unrealistic, economically illiterate, antagonistic, and hypocritical. To this list, we could also note that they are cry-bullies with a glass jaw, as seemingly has been typified by Mehreen Faruqi. Mehreen Faruqi is a Greens senator, sitting in the federal parliament. Like many of the Greens, she's been pictured with pro-Palestinian protesters, donning a keffiyeh and marching and protesting. She was recently, for example, involved in a train wreck of an interview in which she repeatedly refused to call for Hamas, which I'll note is a designated terror organization to be dismantled. It was an absolute dumpster fire of an interview.
Does Hamas need to be dismantled?
Well, listen, the situation with Hamas is that it has nothing, I can't keep repeating it again and again. It has nothing to do with Palestinian statehood and Palestinian self-determination.
No, the question was, does Hamas need to be dismantled?
The Palestinians need to decide where they want to go with their own region, not intervention from Western countries.
So if they choose Hamas, that's okay?
David, that is such, what can I say, like we're creating this hypothetical scenario of what Palestinians, if and when they get self-determination,
well, it's not hypothetical to ask, should Hamas be dismantled?
Rather than actually questioning the Labour government hard on why they aren't stopping this slaughter, why they aren't putting sanctions on Israel. That's the question to ask, not a hypothetical, theoretical scenario that probably is never likely to happen.
Well, let me ask you one more time, and this isn't hypothetical. Do you think Hamas should be dismantled?
Hamas is listed as a terrorist organization, and there is absolutely no change that we are demanding in that.
Should it be dismantled?
Hamas is an organization that exists in the region that we are talking about here, right? Who will dismantle it? It is up to the people in Palestine and that region to make sure that people can live in peace. But I will say this again. At the moment, only some people in that region have the rights that every human deserves.
Okay, but surely you can say,
them don't.
Surely you're able to say whether you'd like to see them gone.
I mean, it's not up to me to say who should be gone or not.
I want to ask you about protests, because the Greens have been sharing, well, lots of videos and so on. This video was the latest. It's the protest that took place at Parliament House on Thursday. It was a security breach. The building was shut down to the public. School kids and so on weren't allowed in. The Greens sharing this video. Are you really encouraging this sort of behaviour, though?
David, I have been to protests, I think, every single week over the last 9 months. We have a right to protest in this country. We have a right to peacefully protest in this country.
But a security breach at Parliament House, you're a senator. Is that something you want to encourage?
We're not encouraging any protests that are, violent. And I think it was a bit rich of the Prime Minister to say that kind of unfurling a banner from the top of the Parliament House was somehow not a peaceful protest. Well, this was a peaceful protest.
It is a breach of security, though. It forces the building to be shut down, the Australian Parliament. What about targeting the War Memorial? Is that okay as well?
Listen, I mean, I again think that talking about some paint on a building rather than what's happening
building,
in Israel.
This is a pretty sacred building for a lot of.
I wouldn't have done it, but I understand that people are angry, and people want some way of the government to listen to them. And if the Prime Minister is interested in people not protesting, then he should sit down with his community, his own community in Grayndler.
Well, speaking of that, you've also been there. I'll show you this is what you've been posting, various images of the protest outside the Prime Minister's electorate office in Marrickville. And you've been sharing a lot of these videos and images as well. It has seen the office shut down for months. People can't get in to access the services that they need to access. Why do you need to blockade an electorate office?
The electorate office, firstly, is not blockaded.
It has been shut down,
that?
Though, and staff have apparently
the
been
Prime Minister
abused,
made that
spat on.
I don't know about that, but like people do have a right to go outside the Prime Minister's office and request.
Now this was a truly catastrophically bad interview. She seemingly was trying to both sides the whole situation. I also happen to remember that in the United States, that when people took over the Capitol building, that was an insurrection. One would wonder whether the same thing might apply if you're taking over Parliament House. Albeit, I digress. You can let me know your thoughts about that in the comments below. Similarly with the equivocation over the defacement and the graffiti on the Australian War Memorial. In short, this was not a well-received interview, and it probably would have been even worse received on a channel other than the ABC. Now, Johannes Leek of The Australian decided to satirise this. The cartoon depicts Mehreen Faruqi in a green outfit and with a keffiyeh, painting over the October 7th graffiti with whitewash, which is conveniently labelled as whitewash just to drive home the point. Mehreen Faruqi has a headband on with Hamas scrolled over it. It's effectively implying that Mehreen Faruqi is soft on Hamas and is attempting to sidestep and downplay October 7th. It also skewers her response to the graffiti on the war memorials by having her state, "What's the big deal? It's just a bit of paint." It's obvious satire. It is obviously skewering her approach to Hamas, her approach to October 7th, and her approach to graffiti. It is obviously there to drive home a point and to make political commentary. Now, Mehreen Faruqi was having none of these nasty cartoons, however. She has threatened to sue for defamation and has demanded an apology from The Australian. She has claimed that the cartoon is racist, somehow, and that the cartoon would cost her votes at the next election. She's effectively claimed that being satirized and being ridiculed is something that shouldn't happen. There's a war on cartoons, seemingly somewhat reminiscent of Anthony Albanese's approach to satire before he seems to have been forced to back down. Now, of course, The Australian has shot back, much like it should, because her complaints about the cartoon seem to be a little bit thin-skinned, and to some extent create a bit of a Streisand effect, an effect whereby someone draws attention to the thing they precisely didn't want drawn attention to. The Australian has refused to apologise and has labelled Mehreen Faruqi as grossly hypocritical. The Australian argues that the cartoon is protected by the truth defence and the honest opinion defences. One might also wonder whether it is also constitutionally protected because of the implied freedom of political expression within the Constitution, and this is political satire and therefore could fall within that implied freedom of political expression. In any case, it would be a rather difficult task to make out defamation in relation to this cartoon. This is all the more the case since the cartoon is clearly satirical in nature, and therefore a reasonable person might not necessarily infer that Mehreen Faruqi goes around with a Hamas headband, but they might infer that she is soft on Hamas in the opinion of the cartoonist. It is clearly political satire. Now, in essence, The Australian is arguing that the cartoon's depiction is both A, true, and also B, even if it isn't, it is an honest opinion on a matter of public importance. The Australian then shot back in a letter to Mehreen Faruqi's lawyers stating that they were, quote, surprised and bemused that your client is threatening legal action, given her comments can only be understood to mean that the barbaric Hamas regime, a listed terrorist organisation and the perpetrators of the October 7th atrocity, has some legitimacy and is supported by the Palestinian people. The Australian was clearly having none of Mehreen Faruqi's comments, clearly arguing that there was either truth or an honest opinion or politically protected satire underlying the cartoon. Johannes Leek, the cartoonist, also for his part hit back, stating, "I think there was a big element of deliberate misunderstanding. It's sort of a confected outrage," he said. They deliberately misunderstand the meaning and motivation behind a cartoon and say, well, it's simply racist, because some people might be offended. The priority of a cartoonist should never be, oh dear, I might upset someone. I think it highlights a very practiced sense of victimhood, deeply ingrained and well rehearsed. It's symptomatic of the sort of woke mindset which is, oppressors oppressed, victims oppressors, and she has almost reflexively turned herself into the victim of some unfair attack. This is the way that these games are played these days, by people who don't understand that satire and the tradition of ridiculing politicians is a way of making robust commentary on the affairs of the day. I'm left scratching my head about this, because I've given her the same kind of caricature and the same treatment that I gave every public figure. And she's given no explanation as to how it was racist, unless she believes that to be portrayed in any negative light amounts to racism. She's a sitting member of the Senate, and being a woman of colour does not make her above criticism, and it does not turn every cartoon about her into an act of racism. I'm sure there are plenty of people who think that it would be great if the only people that could be lampooned were old, straight, white men. but everyone is on the receiving end of satire now and again if they're in politics. It's part of the game. She's a public figure. In essence, Johannes Leek is saying there is nothing to substantiate her claims of racism. And Johannes Leek, one might wonder, might in fact have a case of defamation himself. After all, is he being accused of being racist? How is that accusation being made out? Because this cartoon, to my mind, doesn't have any degree of racism within it. It is depicting her doing a particular act, and there is no racial overtone. It is not depicting her negatively because of race. It is not stating that she's doing anything in particular because of her race. And in any case, I don't think Mehreen Faruqi would actually win this case if it were to go to court. I think she would end up losing quite a lot of money in legal fees, and this would go absolutely nowhere. Furthermore, even if she did actually have a prima facie case, she would need to actually establish damages. She would need to show this cartoon had actually inflicted some form of loss on her. I'm not quite sure how she was going to do that, because she'd have a tough time showing that this cartoon specifically led to her losing votes. And therefore, I don't actually think this case would really go anywhere anyway. But let me know your thoughts about it in the comments below. I'd be interested to hear what you think about the Greens, about Mehreen Faruqi, and about their whole stance on this, and about whether they're really just cry bullies with a glass jaw.